This is the Authority Company Podcast, conversations with leaders designing the future. Hola, I'm Joe Pardavila, and today's guest wrote a book for anyone who needs to communicate under pressure. Dr. Patrick Riccards is a strategic communications vet with 30 years advising Fortune 500 companies, 3 presidential administrations, and organizations facing hard moments. He's also an amateur MMA fighter, and he believes the octagon and the boardroom share more than people think. In his new book, Strategic Strikes, Patrick explains strategic communication as a full contact fight for hearts and minds. He also shows why rigid plans fail and why clear strategy wins. Dr. Patrick Riccards, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I am great. Appreciate having the time with you today, Joe. Thank you.
You're very welcome. And so I got to start by talking about MMA because there have been a ton of books that tie in sports to business, and they use all the analogies, hit a home run, singles and doubles are just as good as, all the analogies. But you're the first that's come across my desk where you tie MMA into strategic communications. So first, obviously, you have a love of MMA. If not, you would have written a whole book revolving around this whole idea.
Well, I think, first of all, I think when we look at it, we always talk about business being such high stakes. We talk about business being a blood sport. We talk about, how many times do we talk about making sure you don't pull any punches, those sorts of things. It seems to be natural. But for me, it's also very personal. It's a sport that I've trained in. It's a sport I'm not very good at it, but I've competed in. And for me, it was a matter of seeing all of those similarities, all of the commonalities when you realize just what goes into training, what goes into becoming an MMA fighter, what goes into becoming successful, the skills you have to build. And the exact same work goes into becoming a successful business communicator. We just don't necessarily realize it. And if you think about it in the same way, we don't like to think sometimes about our opponent having to defeat our opponent, but that's what communications is all about. There's no satisfaction in doing a job well done if you get beaten. There's no satisfaction in getting a job well done if you don't know how to do it. And so that's where this really comes down to. It's really a matter of how do you make sure that you get the training? How do you make sure you build the skills and the knowledge so that you can be the most successful communicator that you can be?
All right. So explain the winning side of it, because I know the big takeaway of your book is that strategic communications is about winning. In MMA, we know the winner, the guy who gets pummeled or the guy who submits, all that stuff. We know who the winner is. How do you know you're winning in strategic communications?
That's a great question, Joe. And I think at the end of it depends on your situation. If you're in a crisis, your company is in a major crisis, communications is the most important thing you can deal with, right? And there, if you're able to contain it, if you're able to make sure that the crisis you're dealing with doesn't last over weeks or months. I can give you an example. Years ago, I was working with a hospital system, and they had discovered that they had a nurse on staff who was an angel of death. She was killing patients in intensive care unit. And so they were working with the local police. They were doing everything that was necessary to stop her and deal with the investigation. They knew it was going to break one day. They knew that this is something that could be incredibly embarrassing, not just to the individual hospital, but to the system themselves. They needed to be prepared. I spent weeks working with their hospital CEO, preparing him for every question that might happen once the news broke. And so what happened? Finally, one Friday afternoon, we get a phone call from one of the local TV stations. They caught wind of it from the local police. An hour later, we have a press conference at the hospital. CEO's doing a stand-up. He's going to take as many questions as the media can ask. They asked every question that they had. He answered every question. There was nothing we had not anticipated. At the end of the day, for the hospital, it was a one-day story. The nurse, they didn't see it coming. And so they showed up at her doorstep. Her son, of course, answers the door, slams the door in the media's face. It became an issue for her for weeks. That was winning the communications war. For the hospital, one-day story, we handled it. We knew how to deal with it. We knew how to make sure that we were talking about it in a way that we were responsible, that we had taken control of the situation. We were working with the families. That's winning. If you want to take it down a notch, not so much crisis. At the end of the day, we all want to make sure that we're being talked about. We all want to make sure that people recognize who we are and what we're doing. And it's one of those, you hear all the time of corporate leaders, nonprofits, government officials. All they talk about is we got to come up with an idea. How to go viral? nobody can figure out how to go viral. It's all a matter of how do we put in the work so that people understand who we are, people understand what we do, and more importantly, people understand why we do it. If you can answer those 3 questions on a daily basis, you're winning at communications.
That's great. Awesome. That's great. Thank you for sharing that example. And I want to double click on crisis because I always wonder, it's so weird with it that I don't know if how much we internalize a crisis as opposed to the external things that are coming in. And what I mean by that is sometimes, you'll see this in popular culture with celebrities and stuff like that, where they're going through a scandal that to them, it's the worst thing in their life or business, substitute business. But like literally like 9 out of 10 people on the planet have no idea like what's going on. How do you separate that? Like, how do you separate like, and obviously not all crises are created equal. Angel of death, that's a bad one. I get that. But not all of them are equal. But at the same time, they all feel like that. Like they all feel like it's the end of the world, even though, like I said, a majority of the world may not even know what the hell you're going through. How do you separate those two in terms of like the idea of it's not just, it's not, even though this is happening to us, maybe most people don't even know it's even happening.
It's a great question. And I'll tell you, I was once working with a politician, and this was one of the issues she was dealing with. She was dealing with a crisis. And it was something that she felt was personally embarrassing to her. A story had come out that, let's just say, went completely against her brand. And she wanted to come out swinging. She wanted to defend herself to anybody and everybody who would listen. The issue was nobody was paying attention to the story. It was a minor thing. She, of course, saw it because most celebrities, what they do is they run those Google searches. They know every single time their name is mentioned. So it was a major crisis to her. And so she's trying to mobilize everybody and anybody to respond on her behalf. And I remember sitting down, I was like, we can't respond to this. If you do that, you're going to make it a larger story than it is. Most people haven't seen this story. You come out swinging, you're going to make it the news. And what happened? She decided to ignore my advice. She went with somebody else. She brought in a team. They decided to ramp up the PR, and they were going to defend her on this story. And what did they do? They made it a national story. All of a sudden, her response got 10x the coverage in the first day than the original story did. And that's why it becomes so important that we have to know, how do you use professionals? How do you bring in those PR, those communication strategists who understand, who can separate that personal from the professional? I've worked with a lot of CEOs. I've worked with a lot of government officials. I've worked with a lot of celebrities. And, one of the things I used to always tease when I would work with a new client is, the only thing worse than a CEO who doesn't know communications is a CEO who thinks he does and doesn't.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's good. That's great advice. I think we've all seen that from the CEO. My old boss used to tell me that it's amazing that when someone gets into the corner office, they believe they're an expert in all things. And so, and I think the good CEOs realize they're not. They have people for that. And it's so funny. The example of your almost client reminds me of, I'm sure you're very familiar with the Streisand effect. If many people don't know the Barbara Streisand story, many years ago, there was like a website that had photographs of her house, and it had something to do with like land erosion or whatever. No one in their right mind was going to be on that site looking at the pictures of Barbara Streisand's house, but she ended up suing them, and it became a story once that happened. So how do you avoid that? Because that's the thing. So like you said, your client, or again, almost client, it was to her, it was everything. Yet the entire, like maybe press or people in her sphere could care less. When do you know that is something that's beyond just your internal bubble?
I think part of it is it has to be a measured response. You have to look at it in the sense of, first of all, who's covering it. If you're talking about this, if you've got a blogger or a vlogger who's got, a couple hundred followers and they're writing something, that's not worthy of a response. If you've got that same blogger, but you're seeing that they're starting to get picked up, then you look at it and say, well, maybe I need to get a third party that's going to say something that's going to inject into this story. For those sorts of situations, I mean, the last thing you want to do is add fuel to the fire, and all of a sudden TMZ's picking it up, and now it becomes a story. But it becomes, your reaction can't be more significant than the initial action. And I think that's really where we because we're so protective of our reputation. We're so protective of our brand. You can see, you see that so often. You see it in politics. You see it in Hollywood. You look at the Blake Lively situation with, her movie and the director and those sorts of things. That never should have been, other than that they have it in the courts, never should have gone that far. It never should have. That was the result of publicists who were trying to win in the case of the director, trying to win for their clients, and really, going over their skis and going well beyond where it should have been. That story should have been over with. And so, a good communication strategist is able to figure out when to pull in the reins, as well as when to turn those horses loose.
Wow, that's great. And also, you mentioned about the fact of like knowing the audience. And you're right about knowing your audience and win hearts before minds, because knowing your audience is that point, like you mentioned. If it's like a blogger who has very little audience that connects to your audience, if there's no crossover, why do you care? But the problem, I think, for a lot of people is they don't know their audience. Even though they think they know their audience, they're like, oh no, everybody knows this one blogger who lives in the basement of their parents in North Dakota. But like, that's not real life. So tell me about how you identify your audience, and when you know that, oh, okay, this person is in my sphere, I need to react to this one thing.
Well, I think that's where it really becomes, all of the research that has to go into doing this successfully, understanding, what is their reach? What have they covered before? What's gotten picked up? It helps you understand that. I think we've seen, how often do we see it on social media? You look at a platform like X, and all of a sudden you get freaked out because you see, oh, somebody just put a tweet up. Somebody just posted about me. Oh no, it's been retweeted 4 times now. Well, you don't know if you're being retweeted by bots. You don't know if this is 4 of his friends who have a total following of 8 people. You have to take the time to really understand who's going in and who's doing this, because our first instinct is to overreact. Again, it's protection. We want to protect ourselves. And so it's really taking that time. First, we got to breathe, because the worst thing you can do is to overreact quickly, because you can't unring that bell. Once you make that statement, once you take that action, you can't take it back. It lives on the internet forever. And so, if that's what you're going to do, it's why, if you're in that big seat, you're sitting in that corner office, you got to have a thicker skin. You have to be willing to take some of what's going to come, because that comes with being a leader. That comes with being in charge. And so that means that, yes, sometimes if it's a personal attack, you let those things go. If it's something that's going at your integrity, if it's something that's going at the heart of the mission of your organization or your business, that's something you take on.
Wow, that's good. That's good to know. I've never had a chance to ask someone this, but since you're like the expert in strategic communications, I'd love to get your take on it. That there was this, obviously the media always reflects what's happening in real life. Like, obvious, I know, but I'm only stating that point because of where I'm going. But then it became that in the early 2000s, with the advent of social media, and you mentioned X and Facebook and the like, all of a sudden posts became stories. Like, it wasn't like a story was always a story because something happened in real life. But then all of a sudden the media started covering like tweets, like so-and-so said this, and this, it became a story. Or like so-and-so, like the internet hates this brand new movie. And then they start pulling like these random tweets from like, oh, absolute no one's, with all due respect. In your world, how did this shift? Like, how did you handle this shift that all of a sudden, like, anyone and their mother could create a story because the media is covering what's on social media? It blows my mind, but this is the world we live in now. We can't unring that bell. But to some, I'm sure it's frustrating that something became something out of nothing.
Yeah, it is. And you're absolutely right. And it's an amazing phenomenon. If you go now to the Huffington Post's website or their app, what you'll see is the majority of articles on their homepage are a reflection of social media posts, mostly about politics and mostly about President Trump these days, but a reflection about that. And you have members of Congress. It's all about what did they post on Twitter? What did they post on TikTok? What videos are they posting? That's what we're covering now in terms of news. And it really has completely changed the space, because what you do now is we're all practicing what's essentially brand journalism. We no longer have to go to those big outlets and convince them to cover a story. We now can do it ourselves. We can do written stories. Those are harder to go viral, but we can post on places like Medium, and we can post on all sorts of websites. We can have our little Reddit, we post on Reddit, we can post on Substack and those sorts of things. But we now know with social media, far easier to slice and dice that and put up Facebook posts, put up TikToks, put up reels, and push that out and push and advertise it and figure out how to get it so that people are watching it. And that's going to pick up, because all of a sudden that's what people are interested in. It's completely changed the dynamic. It gives us as communicators far greater control over the message. But what you see is you've seen such a growth in the number of small media outlets. And you're seeing a lot of the traditional media outlets that have had to cut back on staff. They don't have the investigative reporters anymore. That it's much easier now to see what's trending. How hard is it to go see, okay, what hashtag is trending right now? Let's go see what it is. And it's unfair for me to say that this is just the result of small news outlets that aren't really covering things in a real way, or the Huffington Post. You can see this. You go to the website of the New York Times, and you can find articles that you're describing that are just sort of saying what's trending in terms of social media, that they're reporting on what's being posted on social. That's the world that we're living in, because we recognize that for folks my age, we may still read newspapers. I mean, I read them digitally now. I don't actually get print newspapers. I don't get broadsheets. We may still watch the TV news. I don't anymore, but people do, I assume. But you're talking about an entire nation now, entire generations that are now getting their information and getting their news from social media. I look at my kids who are millennials. They get their news from TikTok. They don't it doesn't matter if it's coming from the New York Times, or if it's coming from the Wall Street Journal, or if it's coming from CNN. They just know news is news. And it doesn't matter where that original source is. It's a matter of, can I tell the story in a minute, and can I do it in an entertaining way that somebody can do a voiceover and comment on it at the same time? It's entertainment as much as it is information.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny too, that one thing I've noticed that during the long part of my career, I started in traditional radio, and, obviously, when you're working in media, there's always a lot of crossover. So I was working with people in other mediums. And I remember when, like, if I had something that was newsworthy, I would throw it out to a couple of a couple outlets, whether it's, newspaper, online, magazines, and stuff like that. And what was always funny to me was the copycat nature of media. So I would literally send, say we had this really cool interview and there was a scoop in it. I would send it to 3 different people. 2 of them would be like, yeah, no interest. No interest. The third would pick it up. It would explode. And then those other 2 would then aggregate that story, which was always funny to me. And that's why I always tell people, when it comes to media, sometimes it's not worth sending a press release to 6,000 people. It's really just getting it to one who's going to then push it out. And then all of a sudden, all the other 5,999 will then pick it up. Tell me about this aggregation world that we're living in, of media, of basically people just, I mentioned media reporting social media, but now you have media reporting media. Media.
But I think you've seen the trend. I mean, you talk about what happened back 20 years ago now, where you started seeing reporters were having to make the shift where they weren't writing for the next morning. Everything was about posting to the blog. So and reporters will tell you that they had to post twice a day to the organization's blog before they would post the next day. That was what was going on with news. And now I think, you see attention spans are such that the aggregation is the way to go. And you saw the steady trend. You saw plenty of, nonprofit organizations and media outlets that would simply aggregate. They grab headlines from all sorts of places and put it together. You saw, major media outlets. You look at, if you cover the political world, you look at outlets like Politico, you look at outlets like Axios, which have created an incredible brand at figuring out how to do some reporting while doing some aggregation, and doing it throughout the day in very small bites. And I think that's the secret to aggregation. Nobody's reading long form journalism anymore. What you're seeing, at least in the written word with regard to aggregation, is the equivalent of getting our news from TikToks. is how can I get that little paragraph, maybe 4 lines long, that's going to give me a summary. And if I'm really interested, I'm going to hope that there's a free link to the news site. It's the best way, as we went through this, the ebbs and flows where you had news outlets that were giving us free content and then everything went behind a paywall. And now aggregation is the only way to get around paywalls because none of us want to pay for it anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think we've all been coached, and I think probably the print medium of all of them probably are affected more than the rest of the mediums because of the fact that they kind of like coached us to be like, okay, here's this story and it's free. And I'm sure the Googles of the world had something to do with it because it helped the reach. And then, they enticed them with ad dollars. And then all of a sudden those ad dollars weren't there anymore. And all of a sudden people are like, oh, shoot, now we have to charge, but no one's going to pay. I mean, the New York Times, say what you will, whatever they have, for whatever reason, they've mastered that paywall thing. And I think you've seen more and more organizations like the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post do it. But man, Patrick, you probably count them in one hand, the ones that could actually get people to pay for their news.
And we've seen broadcast outlets that have failed at it. I mean, I think you're seeing now MSNBC and CNN trying to reboot for the second time with a paywall to get you to get more content. Do we want a CNN Plus? I don't. I don't watch it to begin with. And I think I think that's going to be the great challenge because I think, at the end of the day, to go back to MMA, it's the same thing. I can sit there and I can buy a UFC fight and spend $50 and watch it. But I also know that 5 minutes after the final fight is over, I've got a Russian YouTuber that's going to have it available on YouTube that I can watch for free. It's the exact same thing with the news now. We don't have to pay for it anymore because it's not going to stay on YouTube forever, but it's going to stay up there long enough for me to watch it. And it's going to be the exact same thing with the news. And we see the fight now with regard to YouTube having shut out all of the ABC Disney properties until they can figure out how they're going to work out a pay share. It's Disney that's hurting from that. It's not YouTube, which is ironic. You would think it's YouTube that's really going to be hurt from that. No. They're the largest provider of content right now.
Yeah, it's hard to pick a fighter here because it's like $1 trillion company versus $1 billion company. It's very odd. I think most people probably are like you said, are kind of bending towards that it's Disney's fault kind of thing. But it's so funny that the underdog is Disney of all this. Like where in God's green earth is Disney an underdog? But in this world, they are. You mentioned MMA. We talked about it earlier, but let's tie in a couple of subjects of the book where you mentioned MMA and how you connect it to strategic communication. So let's run through a couple of these. And one of my favorites is the Superman punch. And that relates to public affairs. Tell us again, and I always mention, people know who watch or listen to this podcast, I don't like to spoil too much of the book, so I just want to give people a little bit of breadcrumbs here. But tell me a little bit about the Superman punch.
So for those that don't do the fighting, you have to imagine sort of the Superman pose, where what you're doing is it's the best way to describe it. It's a deke. You're throwing one move and it's a different hit, a different strike that's going to get you. You're involving both the knee and a punch. And so for an individual, you don't know what to expect. You don't know if you're supposed to be blocking a punch or a knee. So if you throw it effectively, it's going to work. Public affairs works much the same way. And, we often think of public affairs in a dirty way. We think of it in terms of lobbying. And it's not as dirty as we like to think it is. We're talking about how do you successfully communicate with those who are making decisions? How do you influence them? And it's one of those. If you think about, we're talking about some of those established newspapers. At the end of the day, how many people are actually every morning reading the New York Times or reading the Washington Post? It's not the nation's newspaper anymore. It is the nation's newspaper if you're those decision makers in Washington, D.C. So you're using that. If you're talking about the public affairs piece, you're figuring out how am I influencing that person? If you are trying to reach individual members of Congress and you're talking about, if I'm trying to reach the Speaker of the House in a communications way, I'm getting Mike Johnson in part because I'm going to make sure that I get something placed in the Times-Picayune down in Louisiana. Not exactly the most important publication if you're trying to work Washington, D.C., but I guarantee everybody on his staff is going to see it. It's going to make his morning clips. It's that sort of thing. It's making sure, how do I make sure that I'm leveraging? It's the same thing we hear all the time. We've been hearing it now probably for 8 or 10 years, of all of those folks that go on Fox News simply because they want to deliver a message to Trump.
Yeah.
That's
Party
public
audience of
affairs.
one, they call that, right?
Exactly. That is public affairs. It's no different than those Democrats that go on Morning Joe because they were trying to reach Joe Biden. It's the exact same scenarios. We're figuring out, how do we reach folks? And it's realizing sometimes communications is not working the media. If you're trying to reach a politician, for instance, how do you work with those organizations that are going to work most closely with them? How do you make sure that you're talking to or influencing the labor unions or business groups or constituent groups back home, or even the nonprofit that his wife or her husband might be working with? All of that comes into play. It's not necessarily that straight on. It's not that punch I'm going to come at you with, but all of a sudden I'm going to hit you. You're not going to have seen it coming, but you're going to get that information.
Obviously politics and pop culture and life sort of, they all kind of get glom off each other. They learn from each other. They do different things. People in entertainment learn from politics, vice versa. We've gotten to this strange place, and you've been in this realm for a while. So we've gotten to this strange place of politics where we're in the sorry, not sorry era of politicians, where you don't have to apologize for anything, or you don't have to admit to mistakes. And as a Gen Xer, Doc, it's very weird for me to be like, why are these people just dragging it out? Like, I get that apologies really sometimes are hollow and don't mean anything, but we've gotten to this weird place. I don't know if Trump's responsible for it, but like, that you don't have to admit mistakes or say sorry for anything. I mean, I'm in Charleston, South Carolina, so we're all going through the Nancy Mace circus at the moment. I'm originally from the New York City area. I mean, Cuomo, for whatever reason, was nearly the mayor of New York, even though he had such a terrible track record and never apologized for anything. What happens next? Are we basically going to start committing crimes and no one's going to care? Like, tell me about this world we're living in now, Patrick.
I think you're absolutely right. I think what it comes down to, it doesn't matter if you're a politician or if you're a celebrity. And remember, the saying in DC is that politics are just for ugly celebrities. That at the end of the day, apologies ring hollow. We don't believe them anymore because we've seen the same people apologize and then do the same things. So, let's just skip right to it and just continue to practice the bad behavior. We don't get shocked by it anymore. We don't get troubled by it anymore. We reelect politicians who do bad things. We love the redemption story in this country. We love to give folks second chances to a degree, but it's something. I mean, you talk about this. It's one of those great things. You talk about the intersect. So I don't know how many people pay attention to all the things that are happening in Washington, D.C., but you've seen over the last 6 months, the Trump administration has been trying to eliminate the U.S. Department of Education, including laying off more than half of the employees at the start of the government shutdown. And last night, now that the government is officially back in, the U.S. Department of Ed posted to their X account. They posted a clip from Keeping Up with the Kardashians. And it was simply a clip of, I believe, Kim Kardashian saying, "Did you miss us?" And I think the caption above was, "You probably didn't, but now we're back." We've now intersected. It's one in the same now. This is all for entertainment purposes. And what we've realized is that at the end of the day, the apology doesn't get us coverage. The apology doesn't get us attention anymore. And quite frankly, the way we get attention, the way we get headlines, the way we go viral is we have to do things that are more and more audacious, that are more and more outrageous. And that's what we drive to now. You mentioned Nancy Mace. That's the perfect example. It would have been perfectly fine. She had berated a gate agent. Okay, just let it go. Now she's going to file suit against American Airlines. She extended the story. Story could have been over. Now all of a sudden, everywhere she's going to go is she's running for governor. Now we're going to have to talk about this lawsuit. That's part of her brand, though.
Yeah. And so, all right, so that's the political world, entertainment world. The corporate world. Can they borrow some of that? Like, do corporations? I mean, I think I still see corporations apologize. Will we get to a point where corporations will suddenly reflect that and be like, yeah, like almost like the Cracker Barrel thing. Yeah, we're not going to apologize. We're just gonna keep doing like. What do you think in terms of like how corporate leaders handle this going forward?
Yeah, Joe, I think you're starting to see it. I think if you look at corporate X sites now, they've become a cottage industry. And those that are getting the most attention are those that are the snarkiest. How often do we see people that are now going to corporate websites asking to be roasted for certain things? How we love seeing those sorts of responses. We love seeing the different fast food accounts going after each other. And I think you're going to see more of that because that's again it's entertainment. We don't want to see mea culpas posted to X anymore. We don't want to have to see, when we used to use on Twitter, we don't want to have to see somebody's long 3-paragraph statement posted to Twitter that we have to read that. Instead, we want to see something cute and snarky on X that we can laugh and share and screenshot and post to other places.
What a wonderful time to be alive, Patrick. Man, what a great time. All right, so let's wrap things up talking about a couple things some takeaways for leaders. The leader finishes your book, wants to improve immediately. Besides working with you directly and talking to you, what's the first habit you hope they start to form tomorrow?
I think the first thing they need to do is they need to realize that communications is an essential. It's a non-negotiable to what they're doing. I think we've gone through these cycles that in the past a corporate leader has almost seen communications as a commodity. They're not. They are just as important as that CFO at their table. They're just as important as the COO at their table. They need to make sure that strategic communications view is factored into every decision that is happening in their organization. And they need to make sure that expertise is sitting at that table and is probably the first and the last person they're talking to before a decision is made.
And internally, you talk about fragmentation weakens strategic communication. So a lot of these people, they could have like a PR silo, marketing silo, their social silo, and then all of a sudden they're all kind of doing things. There could be some infighting or some mean girling, what have you. How do you solve for that for a lot of these leaders that maybe pop in the book and taking these steps and they were like, oh shoot, I have all these departments, but they're not really working together. They're kind of working against each other. Any solutions for that?
I think they need a CCO. They need a chief communications officer. They need someone who all of those opinions are being sorted up through and that it's all being factored in, that you make sure that, yes, are we listening to marketing? Are we listening to public affairs? Are we listening to advertising? Are we listening to social? Are we listening to PR? All of that gets factored in, but you need one person who's going to sort through it all and is going to give you that recommendation that makes the most sense for your brand, for your customers, for your investors, and for you as the leader.
Nice. And we talked about the fighting styles that you mentioned in the book. We want people to check it out. We talked about Superman Punch. But one last takeaway with the MMA style thing. If there was one fighting style here that you think, and I know this could be like asking like who name your favorite child, but like if there's one favorite style in there that you could be like, of all of them, you better get this one right, or at least you got to be efficient in this one thing. Can you point to one?
It's so hard. I think at the end of the day, I mean, you need the grappler, you need the person, you need the street fighter. That's at the end of the day, you need the street fighter. It's the technical expertise is nice, the academic is nice. You need the person who understands the academic side, who understands the process, but you need someone who at the end of the day is going to go to the mattresses. You need someone who is going to fight it out until you get that win. That no matter how many times they get hit, no matter how many times they may get pushed back, they're going to keep slugging. They're going to keep fighting it out. They're going to make sure that at the end of the day, you and your brand are victorious. There's no satisfaction in fighting a good fight if your hand's not raised at the end of the bout.
You can read all about it in Strategic Strikes, Mastering Your Communications in the Cage Match of Public Opinion. He is Dr. Patrick Rickards. Patrick, thanks so much for the time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Joe. I appreciate the time.
And that's going to do it for this episode. If you want to find out more information about Patrick and our other amazing authors, go to theauthoritycompany.com.